My pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the morning. I first came to know Dr. Pat Bradshaw through Professor Vic Murray, who is one of the founding fathers of nonprofit management and philanthropic studies in Canada. And Pat studied under Vic when he was chair of the first formal program of study in the country, chair of York University's Schulich School of Business, where Pat joined the faculty and eventually became a full professor. I learned about her scholarship, particularly in this area of diversity and inclusion, from Vic, but then as I continued on my own academic path, became very familiar with it. I've also become familiar with her leadership, her passion, and dedication for this field, and I want to thank her for sharing her work and knowledge and joining us in community today. So thank you, Pat. Dr. Bradshaw is a professor of management now, and just recently, days fresh off her deanship at the Sobey School of Business at St. Mary's University in Halifax. As I mentioned, she was at the Schulich School of Business, and when she was there, she was director of the MBA program, and she was chair of the faculty senate. Her research interests include the study of organizational power and diversity, and politics, gender, and nonprofit boards of directors. She has consulted with numerous not-for-profit organizations and boards, and through her consulting projects, governance workshops, strategic planning, team building for boards and staff, and training programs, particularly on change management and critical thinking. She served on many boards of directors, including the Association of Researchers in Nonprofit Organizations in Voluntary Action, as well as the board of Ultravest and the Canadian Centre of Ethics in Public Affairs. She's currently a member of the Community Council of Nova Scotia Board and the National Board of Enactus. So let's give a warm prairie welcome to Dr. Pat Bradshaw.
Good morning. I asked Yvonne to shorten that, but it's such a pleasure to be here. I arrived yesterday to your very warm weather and a jazz festival and the market, and it's been so far a real delight to be able to come to Regina and to have a conversation about these topics that are so dear to my heart. I think it's an auspicious day. My husband texted me this morning and said the hummingbird I've been trying to woo back arrived at the window. And so that's a symbol for me of resilience and tenacity and joy and real curiosity. So, in that spirit, I'm going to share with you some of the insights that the academic community has developed on this topic. And of course, it's an area with very deep research and a lot of investigation. And I'm going to spare you all the correlation analysis and all the detailed statistics that we run trying to understand these issues, but highlight for you some of the thinking that we've done to try and give us a bit of a framework and some language to start the conversation that I'm looking forward to deepening over the course of the day. I am very passionate about these topics. I decided in my late teens that I was very, in particular, concerned about social justice issues. And I hate to tell you how old I am, but in those days, the approach that we took to social justice issues was to sit on the floor in what we called encounter groups or sensitivity training circles. Some of you might remember. I got a couple of nods. And we thought if we sat on the floor and shared our feelings, we would change the world. And I'm glad to say we're all sitting in chairs today. But it very quickly became apparent to me that we were not going to change the world only by sharing our feelings, and that there were some deeper issues of power that needed to be addressed. And so I want to start to share a little bit of that reflection and the commitment that I have to how do we bring a commitment to social justice with an analysis of deeper structural issues and power and inequality to some of the discussion, as well as keeping that connection to feeling and the cause that we brought forward through the encounter groups and the sensitivity training that we used to do back in those days. So I'm going to start with a little bit of context, and I'm going to have to ask for your patience as I say next slide, so that the people who are joining us from a distance will know that the next slide's coming. Just build a little bit on Yvonne's comments about the context. Her group has just done this remarkable study of what's happening here in Saskatchewan around the actual representation of different groups. And the statistics are quite compelling. There is really good representation in the nonprofit and voluntary sector of people over 55. There's very good representation of women. When you start to look at youth, it gets worse. When you start looking at members of Indigenous communities, it's not as good. When you start looking at what in that study they call new Canadians, it's not good at all. One survey that I've done over a number of years of nonprofit boards, you can see the statistics here. Most board members were between 30 and 60 years of age. Really strong representation of women relatively, 40%, 44% were women. But only 28% of boards reported even one person with disability. Only 22% reported that they had even one person from the LGBTQ and two-spirited communities. And only 13% reported on having anybody that would be defined as visible minority or from a designated group. And it's those dynamics that are happening at the board level, in the volunteer community, and in the membership of nonprofit organizations is what we're here to talk about. And it's, of course, systemic. So it's more than just in the boardroom, and it's more than just in the voluntary sector. But it's a kind of a compelling story, and those numbers have not moved very much over the 20 years of various surveys that we've been doing. In the corporate sector, I think corporate boards are now up to about 12 to 15% women, but we don't even measure other groups in corporate boardrooms. So these are issues that I think are of really ongoing importance for us to address. And I'll ask for the next slide. And as I do a little bit of just definition, the first concept in the title of our event is diversity. And I want to say that there's a lot of evolution in the definition of diversity. And for a lot of us, diversity might mean diversity of opinions. Simply, do we have different perspectives represented in the room? Do we have people with different educational backgrounds? For others, it's do we have different values and beliefs and cultural backgrounds represented in the boardroom? Today, I think we're looking more at some of the other definitions, and this list is very long, so I will not try and go through the whole thing, but we're looking at what's our diversity and what's the representation of our nonprofit organizations around issues of race, gender, socioeconomic status, sexual identity, ability, religion, age, ethnicity, gender identity and expression, First Nations status, etc. So there's many, many elements. And as we start to grapple with that, the complexity, it's a little like peeling an onion. We might start with one aspect of diversity. And as we start to look and deepen our understanding, we start to appreciate, women aren't all the same, right? We need to start to look at the intersections and the overlaps and the ways in which we can nuance and understand diversity more richly. So it's complex, it's challenging, it's difficult to start to peel that onion back and start to look at it. But let me tell you a little bit about the research. Because the research is showing us that the benefits of doing this are really convincing to me. So we know, for example, that organizations and boards that are more diverse have better financial performance. It pays off, right? It's good business. And I'll put quotations around the word business. So we know that. We know that organizations that are more diverse actually perform better. We know that groups that include more diversity, and this is where I'm sparing you the statistics, because we've got all these correlations and they're significant. Groups that are more diverse are more creative. They make better decisions. Now, I do have to be honest and tell you that they also have more conflict, right? It's not easy. It's not easy when you're trying to bring multiple perspectives together to make these decisions. But the outcome, if you can learn how to be more inclusive and create the space for the multiple perspectives and the different opinions and the different lived experiences, are that we make better decisions. We also know that diverse groups represent the community better. So if you're looking, and I think we have government representatives here today, hopefully we've got funders here today. We know that if we can better represent the communities we serve, we're going to be able to respond better to the requirements of the government for funding and donors. We know that we're going to be able to bring those stakeholders into the room and be able to meet the needs and expectations of those groups better. Does everybody know what a stakeholder is? Somebody once came up to me and said, "Why do you keep talking about a plate with a piece of meat on it?" So I'm actually talking about stakes in the ground, right? People that have a profound interest in what you're trying to do. And we're better able to attract and retain top talent. And certainly in this day and age, getting the top talent into the organization is a critical factor. So next slide, please. We know now, a little bit about what is diversity and what are some of the benefits of it. I'm going to move to the second part of the title of this day, which is inclusion. And it's quite fascinating. I want to share with you a little bit about a research study that one of my colleagues and I, Chris Fredette, who's now at the University of Windsor, did. And we went out in the community and we started interviewing people like all of you who work in this sector, in the voluntary sector, and who are very deeply committed to diversity and inclusion. And we did a kind of semi-structured interview with people, and we said, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you? And how do you go about creating more inclusive not-for-profit organizations and boards? And we realized that as academics, we were coming at these topics from a perspective of exclusion. Who was being excluded from the board and the organization? Who was being left out? And being academics and being somebody who's very passionate about power, I was coming at it from a perspective of anti-oppression, systemic inequality, racism, sexism. I was coming at it from a perspective of understanding privilege. Where's that backpack of taken for granted advantages that we often carry with us? And how does that show up? And it was even in the paper this morning. Did anybody get a chance to read about the Loblaws store where somebody witnessed somebody at the cashier going to this Indigenous woman and her sister? Do you have the money to pay for that? Right? And she works for a nonprofit. She stood up and intervened, met them outside and said, "Look, I'm really uncomfortable. What just happened there?" And they went to the manager and the manager apologized. She became an ally. And there's this wonderful picture of the three of them in a selfie. So those are the kind of dynamics that we start to name when we talk about privilege and exclusion. And it's really important today, and I think as you hear from the panelists this morning, that many of them are going to bring that perspective to bear. And for some of us, that language of systemic inequality, of colonialism, of oppression, is going to make us feel a little uncomfortable. And what we want to do today is say, let's try and understand and unpack that and see if we can get more comfortable with some of that language. Because we need to understand how exclusion and tokenism and assimilation dynamics unfold in our organizations. At the same time, when we were doing those interviews, we were really intrigued with the fact that people use this language of inclusion. So it wasn't a focus on exclusion, it was a focus on inclusion. And inclusion brings that element of hope, that element of optimism. It brings that commitment to creating a space where we can genuinely welcome difference, where we can work together to create the synergies that are possible across those differences that we bring. And so it's about power sharing, it's about indigenization, it's about respect, and it's about meaningful engagement. And it's a much deeper, I think, conversation if we can hold what I think might be paradoxical, that capacity to understand the dynamics of exclusion and understand the dynamics of inclusion, right? How do we bring that creative tension together today to talk about diversity, inclusion, and some of the other dynamics that inform and create the cradle that we're trying to bring that hummingbird into? Okay, so that's just a little bit of my reflection on inclusion. Can I get the next slide? I want to just deepen the conversation. You know, as academics, when we go out and do these interviews, we then start to code the comments that people make, and we start to look for the patterns, and we do this deep dive into what's happening there, and we all of a sudden realized that people were talking about different kinds of inclusion, different dynamics of inclusion. So I want to just share with you that actually what we found was two different kinds of inclusion being unfolded in the conversations with the people we were interviewing. The first we're calling functional or instrumental inclusion, and the second is social or relational inclusion. And I'm going to go into some examples of each kind of inclusion in a minute. But one is more goal-focused and more purposeful on the outcomes and the measures and the quantification. The social or relational is more about the social fabric of the organization and what does diversity contribute. And it's meaningful connections and relational acceptance. It's kind of that authentic engagement. And that's an interesting dynamic to explore when we break that down, that dynamic of inclusion, can we start to get more reflective in how we talk about it? So if I go to the next slide, being academics, of course, we can only do 2 by 2, right, Yvonne? One day we'll have virtual reality and we'll do all these fun 3-dimensional things, but typical academics, we came up with a 2 by 2. And down one side is the commitment to increasing functional inclusion, and along the bottom is an commitment to increasing social inclusion. And we thought to ourselves, you know, there's lots of organizations and boards that are totally disengaged and aren't doing anything. They're putting diversity into, for example, a board, and then just letting it sit there, not doing anything to make the diversity work. And then you get dynamics of tokenism, right? Where you turn to somebody and say, so what do you women think about this? Right? As if I could speak for every woman on the planet. And then you also get dynamics of assimilation, where all of a sudden everybody's expected to be the same. You may be different. You know, you may have a different skin color, but you're just like one of us. And it's not capturing that spirit of what's possible through the diversity by recognizing how we bring that difference. So disengagements in that space. But we then heard within our interviews that if people have a genuine commitment to both the more instrumental or functional inclusion and the relational inclusion, that there's a possibility here for transformational inclusion. And that I want to talk to you about in a few minutes when I've gone through some examples of each of these. But it's really an opportunity to create something new, something that goes beyond the current situation. It's this transformational inclusion. So let me share with you some of the strategies under each of these. And if we go to the next slide, strategies for functional inclusion. And I think one you probably heard about the most often is the business case. And I'm a business school former recovering dean. So, but the business case is one that is, I would call a kind of a classic functional inclusion strategy, where sometimes we even do a SWOT analysis and we do the strengths and weaknesses, threats and opportunities, and we bring it together. And what's the business case? What is the advantage to increasing diversity? So that we can make an argument to people who might be resistant to increasing the diversity in your organization. You can say, look, this is just good business logic. It's going to increase the creativity of our decision making. It's going to allow us to reflect our stakeholders better so that we can make a better case to funders that we're being representative of our communities. It's going to make us more high performing. And so we'll have better financial results and better performance. And you start to measure and quantify the arguments for diversity. And a lot of us have used that kind of a logic in order to help move people who are disengaged and not committed to dynamics of inclusion and diversity. Bring them along with us to make the case. So if you've got a board, for example, that's not there, coming forward with the business case can be really helpful, because a lot of our board members are business people. They get the logic of the business case. So it's being able to articulate what will be added to the conversation in the boardroom, or be added to the ability, and we went through some of the advantages of diversity. Better able to retain and attract top talent, better able to make decision-making the results and better financial results, better able to make the case to donors and funders that we're representing our communities. All those logics are part of the business case. We also found that, that old adage, what gets measured gets done. And within a functional inclusion perspective, what we find is that often organizations that can set goals, we're going to move the benchmark on some of these elements of diversity in more coherent ways. And I know that there's a tension always in having quotas. And I'm not a big fan of quotas myself, but there is a way in which, if we can say that we're going to create more diversity and invite new communities and new voices into our decision making and into our organizations, that having that ability to measure and to quantify where we are, and I think that's where the survey that Yvonne and her team are doing here in the province, to say, how are we tracking as a province on these dimensions of diversity, is a really important part of functional inclusion. So we can start to say, where are we in moving the bar in the inclusion of different groups? Sometimes that gets done through diversity committees. So I have seen very effective organizations that have a board committee, for example, which is it may be a temporary working group, it may be a permanent board committee, committed to diversity and to starting to embed policies and procedures that are going to enhance diversity and inclusion actually in the operating structures of the board and what the board is measuring. It gets embedded in the strategic plan. And we know that boards oversee strategic plans. So if you're an executive director and you want to get your board to buy in, you present a strategic plan. Hopefully they come with you as you embed inclusion and diversity in the plan. So it's, again, how do we start to create the practices that are going to make for a more welcoming, inclusive, diverse organization, a more welcoming, inclusive, diverse board. So targets, explicit kind of policies, embedding it in a strategic plan. I think you know that a lot of boards, for example, have a matrix, a skills matrix, and they put the skills we need along the top, We need an accountant, we need a lawyer, we need an HR person, right? We need representatives of our community. We need a couple of donors. We need a government rep. If each nonprofit has its own dimensions. Then you put the names of your current board members down the side and you go, okay, we got a gap here. We really got to go and get one of those CPAs. But more and more boards are starting to include an overlay of diversity on that. So which communities do we have represented? What groups are represented? And how can we get a CPA who comes from a group that's not represented in our board or who's underrepresented? So those kind of very explicit, intentional strategies used by nominating committees or used by governing committees really help, again, because it brings a focus and a discipline to it. Actually, we're going to wait. Can you just jot it down? Sure. Yeah, because I think we're on. I got to get you on the mic, and I've got it. Yeah. Also, positive searches, making sure that when you're doing recruitment, you're embedding those kind of criteria, and you're reaching out. I've seen very effective mapping of communities. One hospital I worked with did a survey of their patients. And they found out that their patients in their hospital, this was a relatively small hospital in Toronto, were largely from the Italian community and the Mandarin speaking community. And they looked at their board and went, we've got quite a few Italian speaking board members of that ethno-cultural group, but we don't have anybody from the Mandarin speaking Chinese community. And they then partnered with community groups from the more Chinese Mandarin speaking community and advertised board positions, went out and networked with those organizations to enhance the representation of that community on their board. So again, it's very intentional, it's very focused. And they partnered with organizations and they built that pipeline. That's the other thing. Sometimes, for example, in universities, we're trying to recruit faculty members from communities where traditionally they've been excluded from universities. They don't have the PhDs that we're looking for. So it's how do we improve that pipeline so that we've got people coming through who are going to have that PhD, and encouraging, for example, people from underrepresented communities, Indigenous communities, et cetera, to get engaged in the learning process. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which is strategies for social inclusion. And this one you may be more familiar with. These are strategies that a lot of nonprofits use to bring people on board. And for example, how many of your organizations do really great orientations? Ooh, maybe not as many as I thought. Okay. Often we just say, well, welcome to the board, or you're hired, and here's your desk, right? You're going to start work Monday morning at 9 o'clock, and the poor person's going, okay. And especially if we're bringing people in from different communities, it's really important to think about social inclusion. How do we make people feel welcome? And the work I've done in boards in particular is, they often will appoint somebody to mentor. If you're bringing somebody, a youth, somebody who's 22 years old and it's their first board or meeting, they're a little intimidating. So how do we help bring these people on board? How do we help them understand this is the format of the meeting? These are Robert's Rules of Order. Here's the way the agenda unfolds. And then phone them up after the meeting and say, what'd you think? How did you feel about that? And help them get onto committees that are going to give them the chance to have a voice and have the courage to speak up. Because if we don't have people being part of those communities, it's not going to be helpful. So mentors, coaches, orientation sessions, all of those things that would enhance social inclusion. My research, when we interviewed people, also showed that humor, it's a hugely important aspect of inclusion. And both people that we interviewed who were breaking down barriers by getting on boards where their communities had not regularly been represented, they used humor as this tool to make people understand where they were coming from, So it's that fine-edged sword, but it was a fascinating way of building trust, building respect, building mutual understanding. How many of your organizations have had retreats and workshops and training? I'm on the Community Sector Council Board in Nova Scotia, and we're going to have a training session in September, which I can hardly wait, on decolonializing our organization. So all those kinds of workshops and training sessions are so important in building that trust in the context so that you can have these conversations, so that we can deepen our appreciation for how we can be more inclusive. And it's simple things like accommodating board meetings and events around people's religious holidays. It's nice, it's the end of Ramadan. It would be hard to have a meeting during that period because people won't be able to participate in a lot of the rituals. It's making sure we're accessible to wheelchairs and to people who need signing and other kinds of accommodations. Sensitivity to privilege, and Rhonda's got an exercise she's going to lead us through later on, starting to understand some of that, and the cultural translation. So the second last slide I have is about this transformational inclusion. What we learned when we started to do the statistics, when you increase diversity on boards, we did a survey after we did these interviews. And in the survey, we correlated increased diversity with performance in the boardroom. Nothing changed. When you simply increase diversity and measured outcomes, nothing happened. But when you also put in place functional inclusion, activities, and diversity, all of a sudden the performance of the board went up. And it was statistically significant. Little less so for social inclusion, relational inclusion, but it also had an impact. And then this phenomena that we think can happen with transformational inclusion is when you have increased diversity, functional inclusion, and social inclusion, something magical starts to happen. And you start to transform the organization. And my co-author, Chris Fredette, used the metaphor of a child baking a cake for the first time. And they've got the mixing bowl out, and mom says to the little boy, right, put the egg in. Puts the egg in the mix. She goes, honey, you got to break the egg. You got it. Something gets changed here, and then you beat it up, and you've got this mixture that's nothing like the dry elements of the flour. I haven't cooked in a long time. Sugar, salt. What goes into a cake? And the egg and the milk, right? And it transforms. You put it in the oven and you heat it up, and you have that kind of tense discussion about inclusion and diversity, and it becomes this magical cake that we all enjoy sharing together in a communal way. I think that's what transformational inclusion is. And that's the vision and the potential of what we're trying to talk about here today, is how can we create more diversity and more inclusion in order to create something that's remarkably new and remarkably exciting, and something that will be able to benefit all of us. So my last slide is just the invitation for the morning and the afternoon. Let's keep learning. Let's keep focusing on our own personal growth. These are not easy conversations. I remember very early on reading, I don't know if any of you are Jungian, Marion Woodman talked about being daughters of the patriarchy, and how as a woman and a feminist, I had to own my own sexism and my own collusion in the patriarchy. And I think these conversations invite us to have those deep reflections about where am I internalizing racism, sexism, and other isms and other dynamics of oppression. How do I carry them personally? And where's my privilege that I'm not even aware of where my collusion in those dynamics is? it's an opportunity for celebration. We're going to hear some wonderful stories about what other organizations are doing to advance these issues and to move forward. It's a little bit of risk taking, and hopefully we can get a climate where we can invite feedback and build those strategies for transformation, innovation, and survival of a sector that, frankly, we're all facing times of disruption and chaos. So the more we can bring multiple perspectives together, I think the more hope there is for us addressing some of the profound changes that are happening in the voluntary sector right now. So that's my remarks.
So we have some time, I think, till 10, Yvonne, for question and answer. Now, remember that there are people outside this room who are needing to hear, and which mic do they come to speak if they have a question? No, but if the people here want to ask a question, they'll use this one. Okay, so you'll have to come, or I'll have to, oh, I can take it off, okay. So I'll bring the mic over to you, and we'll take a break at 10 o'clock, but we have some time for questions, if you're okay with that, yeah? All right. Yes, so let's get you on mic here, right?
I feel like a celebrity. Anyway, I was just curious, you touched on having a skill set when you're recruiting for boards or governance, and so often we look for education and not focus on experience. I'm wondering if there's an element of experience that brings value to a board. And I'll just give an example. So, we've done the diversity thing with boards, and if we don't have the chair who has the power and control, with the experiences around inclusivity or diversity, how do they control the conversations and ensure that everybody's heard?
Chairs are. Is this on? Chairs are so important, that role. And I think sometimes we do oh, it's your turn to be chair, instead of being more intentional about who's the best person to be the chair and what are the skill sets they bring. And if we can make that a selection criteria, that would help. But, this morning, when we go into the round circles, we're going to do a talking circle. Sometimes there may be ways that we can create structures to support the chair, to build in different approaches, but it's a tricky one.
I'm just wondering if everybody is aware what a talking circle is, and if we could just define that, because I'm not sure if everybody has had the experience
So
with that.
the facilitators just before that will,
perfect.
yeah,
Awesome.
we'll do that right after the break.
Question back there.
In your study, I'm curious of your research body. Like, was it mostly maintained within like Ontario, or were you looking at nonprofits?
Yeah, the original interviews were limited to Ontario, but the survey itself went out across the country. But it's a few years out of date now, to be honest. It's more the conceptual framework I was trying to elucidate than the results. Yeah. It needs more study.
Okay, now we're going to go to our virtual meeting room and see if there are any questions from the room for Pat. Tara, any questions for us? Not yet. Okay, so we have anyone else here?
Sorry, I just wanted to ask that because do you find that the laws regarding what's required on job descriptions and what's required on that selection process are, because I know myself, having worked in that field specifically, I see things like going to Ontario, every job is posted with respect to a person with a disability who can't drive, or a person from a lower socioeconomic background who doesn't have a driver's license. Whereas in Saskatchewan, almost every single nonprofit always requires driver's license on every job description.
Interesting. I'm going to leave it there because I think clearly you've got more insight than I do. That's all amazing. Couple over here.
Take a few more here. And I was asked if
Oh. How do you see the move to professionalization and credentialing of board members by external bodies as restricting community members who would normally be representative of other groups? Because I have a lot of worries about that. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I'm a big believer that there's no one governance model. John Carver doesn't like me very much. So I do worry that a lot of that credentialing is signaling that there's one best way of running a board. And in the voluntary sector, we've got to create space for different governance models. And so it does worry me. And I do think we need to be conscious and alert.
Oh, we have time for.
You had mentioned, and maybe I missed something, that social and functional inclusion are not enough, and I'm wondering what those other things are. If I missed that point, or
I think
could
what
you
I was trying
elaborate?
to say, thank you for clarifying, is social by itself is not enough. Functional by itself is not enough. We need both. We need both, and that's where the transformative potential comes from. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah. Stand up.
Oh, okay. So my question is a little bit around recruitment and recruiting for diversity. I think often that, we look at our board structures and say, oh, well, we need more women on our board. But we don't necessarily pair that with we need more women with the competencies that we need. And I think that that's an important element. So people don't just exist in their little silos. They're not just an Indigenous person. They're not just, but they come with all of these competencies. So I think it's important to marry competency with the diversity that you're looking for. And I just didn't hear that come through.
Yeah, thank you. Again, that's the matrix I was talking about. Is, we need the skills matrix, but we need to overlay the diversity on it and bring it together. Absolutely. The other thing, I was doing affirmative action at York University, and it wasn't, again, quotas. It was about, can we be proactive and positive in our searches? So do we have clear criteria? Did we do active outreach into underrepresented communities to get people to apply? Did we rank people according to the criteria? Were we systematic? But at the end of the day, you want somebody who's qualified, right? So that we need to be able to bring rigor, but also not be complacent, because people are not going to apply for these jobs if we aren't doing proactive outreach and we aren't using unbiased selection processes, and if we aren't making them feel welcome during the recruitment process, and if we aren't, monitoring our biases and our assumptions on the way through, that would result in exclusion. So I think it's a complex dance.
I think if there's one more short question before we break. Right.
Hi. I know there's board positions that are paid. There's also a lot of board positions, especially for the nonprofit, that are not paid positions. And so this is where we're having an issue, especially getting a wider range of board members, is that economic problem. You can't volunteer somewhere if you're out looking for work. And it's just a statement. There's not really an answer for that, but just, yeah, a problem we're having.
Yeah, it's challenging to find board members. There's, Yvonne, how many nonprofits in the country? 160,000? all looking for board members. It may be time to do some creative rethinking about how we structure governance, but that's another day's workshop.
Yeah. All right, I think it's fitting for us to thank Dr. Bradshaw for her keynote and for her